All right, welcome to our Wednesday webinar series. Today's Wednesday webinar is the Produce Safety Rule of the Food Safety Modernization Act and the records you need to keep. Below also is two upcoming ones, the Urban Soil Quality, as well as selling your farm eggs to retail outlets. The web link up here in blue is where you'll find more details about the webinars as well as the archived webinars that we have. We'd like to thank our sponsors of the Women in Ag program, as well as the collaborators of the program. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sarah Everhart, and she's going to start the presentation today. Sarah?
Thanks, Shannon. Yes, so today we are going to be talking about the Produce Safety Rule of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which I will be calling FSMA, and the records you need to keep. So I have a lot to go through today. I am going to give you some links for some resources that explain FSMA in more detail, and the Produce Safety Rule specifically in more detail. It's a complex federal law, and if I tried to explain it all today, we'd probably be here till midnight. So we're just going to try to keep it to record keeping today. That being said, if you have any questions as we go along, go ahead and type them into the chat box. If I can answer them, I will. If I can't answer them, I'm going to give you my email, my contact information on the last slide. Feel free to contact me. I will try my best to find the answer for you. So I work for the Agriculture Law Education Initiative. And we are a partnership of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, the University of Maryland, College Park, and the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. We are an empowering program. Moving right along, there is our website, umaglaw.org. If you've never been to our website, I encourage you to check it out. We have lots of legal publications written in an easy-to-understand way. We have videos, we have important links. You can sign up for our quarterly update so you can find out what new resources we have coming out and what events we have coming up. We also write for the Maryland Risk Management Education blog. We update it 3 to 4 times a week. It's co-sponsored with the Crop Insurance Education Program and the AREC department at College Park. It's a great place to find answers to common ag law questions. And you can search past posts. A lot of times folks call me and ask me questions, and I direct them to a past post on the blog. So it's a good source for researching legal issues. And lastly, we have an important conference coming up on November 17th. It's our 3rd annual Agriculture and Environmental Law Conference. It's going to be from 8 to 3 at the Doubletree Hotel in Annapolis. We're going to talk about a lot of hot topics, antibiotics and livestock, conservation in the 2018 Farm Bill. We're going to have federal and state policymakers there to give us their insights. We'll have farmers presenting their side of things. So if you have an interest in environmental issues, if you're a farmer who has to deal with environmental regulations, I encourage you to sign up. It's a diverse crowd. We try to bring environmental stakeholders, agricultural stakeholders together, have everybody in the same room, and hopefully try to have a greater understanding of these issues. Registration's open now, and it has sold out the last 2 years, so I encourage you to register. Just a quick disclaimer, I am just here today to provide education. This isn't legal advice. If you need individual legal advice, you should talk to your personal attorney. Okay, so the Food Safety Modernization Act. It was passed back in 2010, but we're really just talking about it now because of the finalization of some of the implementing regulations, which we'll get into. But the FDA, because of FSMA, now has a legislative mandate to require comprehensive prevention-based controls across the food supply. This was based, or the reason for this was because of some troubling statistics about foodborne illnesses, and it really transformed the FDA's approach from investigating outbreaks to preventing outbreaks. There's a lot of different parts to the Food Safety Modernization Act. Today we're just going to be talking about the Produce Safety Rule. However, as you can see, there's many other components to this which may affect you or your operation depending on what kind of operation you have. So I encourage you to try to learn more. If you do more things on your farm than just grow produce, there could be different parts of this rule, such as the preventative controls part of the rule that has to do with food processing that may affect you. All right, so the produce safety rule. The produce safety rule establishes science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fruits and vegetables grown for human consumption. The rule was finalized in November 2015. The good news is it's very similar to Maryland GAP standards. So if you have been trained in Maryland GAP, you're probably very close to being on your way to being FSMA compliant. There's a couple differences. The main difference being that GAP is voluntary and the produce rule is not, unless you're exempt, and we'll talk about that. And the other main differences are that there are some record-keeping requirements, which is why you've tuned into this today, and there's also some substantial water testing and quality requirements. To learn more about the different parts of the produce safety rule, I encourage you to check out a video that I did that's on the ALEI website, at umaglaww.org. There's a video that goes through more specifics of the produce safety rule, and there is also an FDA guidance document that's on the food safety page of the ALEI website. Okay, so you're probably thinking, please help me get me out of this rule. Well, some people can get out of it. Some growers may be excluded from coverage based on the type of things that they grow. So if you grow foods that are rarely consumed raw, such as a potato, or only food grains, you may not be covered by the rule. And there's also an average annual produce sale benchmark that you have to reach in order to be covered by the rule. You also may be exempted from the rule if your food that you grow goes directly to a processor that involves a kill step. So if you're growing tomatoes, but they're going to be getting processed, and there's going to be a bacterial kill step before they reach the end consumer, then that may be a way for you to be exempted from the rule. So let's talk about that a little bit more specifically. I have been talking about this rule for a couple of years now, and I've tried my best to come up with a simple way to explain this. So I hope this is clear for folks. And again, if it's not, feel free to contact me, and I can help you figure out if this rule applies to you or not. This little graphic I thought made the most sense. So if you start from the bottom, farms with less than $25,000 in annual produce sales are not covered by the rule. And that is actually averaged over the previous 3 years, that figure. And to make things a little bit more complicated, that was the number that was in the rule. It is allowed that, however, it's adjusted for inflation, so it's actually $26,632 right now, if you were factoring back the 3 years to make that 3-year average. So if you're just starting out, if you've only made $18,000 off of produce sales in the last 3 years, then the rule doesn't apply to you. If you make more than $500,000 off of annual produce sales in the last 3 years, it definitely applies to you. There's no question the entire rule is going to apply to you. If you make somewhere in the middle on annual produce sales, and again, this is just produce, in the last 3 years, you may qualify for a qualified exemption to the rule, which means parts of the rule will apply to you and parts of the rule may not apply to you. Here's a little bit more information about the qualified exemption. So to be eligible for the qualified exemption, more than half of the average annual monetary value of the food the farm sold was directly to qualified end users, and that's in the previous 3 years. And I underline the word food there because whereas before we were talking about produce sales, this qualified exemption part of FSMA uses the word food, and that encompasses everything. So to meet this qualified exemption rule, you have to look at grains, if you have animals on the farm, the value of that plus produce. So you have to meet that first part of the standard there. Directly to qualified end users, which means the consumer of the food, or directly to a restaurant or retail food establishment that is located at the same state or not more than 275 miles from the farm, and the average annual monetary value of all food the farm sold during the 3-year period was less than $500,000. So If that's you, if you sell all of your food directly to a qualified end user and all of the food meets that monetary standard, you may be eligible for a qualified exemption. Okay, moving on. So if you grow produce, you need to keep records in order to comply with the produce safety rule. Because if your operation is not subject to the law, let's say you've only made $19,000 off of produce sales in the last 3 years, you need to keep certain records to prove that you are exempt. In addition, if your operation is subject to the law, you need to keep certain records in order to be in full compliance with the law. So that's really something I want to kind of hammer home to folks. I think some folks are starting to learn about this law and they may see some of those exemptions and think, this doesn't apply to me, I don't need to do anything about this, and kind of tune out. When really, even if you find out that this law doesn't apply to you, you still need to keep some records to be able to prove that. All records that are kept for FSMA need to include the following: the name and location of your farm, actual values and observations obtained during monitoring, which will be applicable for certain things as we'll go through, an adequate description, the commodity name, specific variety or brand name when available, or lot number of the covered produce applicable to the record. So they need to be specific. You need to have the date and the time of the activity documented, and records must also be created at the time the activity is performed, observed, and they need to be accurate, legible, indelible, dated, and signed by the person who performs the activity. Here's a couple typical record-keeping questions that I've posed, thinking this is what folks would probably be most interested in. Must I store my records on site? The answer to that is no. Off-site storage is allowed. However, you have to be able to retrieve the record within 24 hours. Can you keep electronic records? Thankfully, yes. And they're considered to be on-site at the farm if they're accessible from an on-site location on the farm. So if you have records and you scan them in and you can pull them up from a cloud database or something like that, that is considered acceptable. How long do I have to keep the records? The general rule is 2 years past the date the record was created. However, if you're talking about those 3-year periods for those qualifying exemptions we were talking about, then you've got to keep them for 3 years. If you're saying that this rule isn't applicable to you because you've only made $22,000 in produce sales for the last 3 years, you're going to need 3 years of records to back that up. Are the records subject to disclosure? The answer on this is yes. The records obtained by the FDA in accordance with the Produce Safety Rule are subject to the disclosure requirements of the Public Information Act. It is recommended that you label your records confidential to reduce the likelihood that a farm's records would be released in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. In Maryland, the Maryland Department of Agriculture is going to be implementing the Food Safety Modernization Act. I would suggest to folks that are dealing with FSMA, I would keep careful records and I would create separate records specifically for compliance with this law. Simply for the reason, if the Maryland Department of Agriculture or the Federal Food and Drug Administration were to ever ask for your records, if I was the farmer being asked for the records, I wouldn't want to have to give over all of my personal business records, all of my operational, documents. I would want to have a separately kept folder that is just for my FSMA compliance needs. And so that's what I was hoping to accomplish with this webinar as well, to kind of walk you through the records you need so that you can keep them, and so you'll be well equipped if you're ever faced with a record review for FSMA compliance. All right, so what do I need to retain if my produce is going to receive a further processing kill step? Well, you do need to retain some documentation. Documentation accompanying the produce stating that the food is not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. So You would need to send this along with the food so that it's abundantly clear that this cannot be sold for consumption, that you're intending that this is going to be sold for further processing. And you also need a written assurance from the customer that the produce will be processed to adequately reduce microorganisms of public health significance. And this must be something that's done annually. So if you enter into a contract with someone who's going to be processing your tomatoes, this is something that you would need to receive back from them. You would need to send the documentation there on the first little bullet mark, and then you'd need to get the documentation back from them. Okay, what if I don't think that the produce rule applies to me because my farm has made less than $26,000 in annual produce sales over the past 3 years? What do I need to keep? Well, you need to retain records such as receipts to demonstrate your farm's produce sales. Obviously, this is going to be easier if all your farm does is sell produce, but we all know, there's a lot of diversified operations out there. You might have an agritourism component to your operation. You might have livestock or, cut flowers or things that are unrelated to produce. So you have to retain the specific receipts that are going to prove just the produce sales. You need to keep a written record reflecting an annual review and verification of the farm's continued eligibility for the exemption. And it has to be dated and signed by a supervisor. So this has to be a rolling average. You can't just do it this year based on the last 3 years and then say, I'm done with that. Every year you need to average 3 years, the most recent 3 years, and continue that exemption, proving that you're entitled to that exemption. What if you're eligible for the qualified exemption? Again, you have to retain records such as receipts, and you have to retain that annual review that's signed by a supervisor. I'm going to be providing you all with some examples of records. These are all from the Produce Safety Alliance, and the Produce Safety Alliance is a great source of information. They've created some of these templates. If anyone can't get to these, I'm happy to send you the link. You can just email me and I'll give that to you. I am going to note that these records have not been approved by the FDA. However, the Produce Safety Alliance is the folks, they're the group that is training the trainers across the country on this rule. And I think these are a good source of information. FDA has not released any model records. So this is, I would say, the best form of help you could get so far to start keeping these records. And these are relatively simple, which is another thing I like about them. So as you can see, it makes it sort of dummy-proof for you. It has your name and address of the farm, the date, your sales for each year, and then this is for the qualified exemption. Has the formula you need to be able to be eligible for that rule. And then in addition to this record, you would just need to have actual sales receipts. So if you had this record and sales receipts all together, you would be prepared to make that showing if you were asked that you were eligible for that qualified exemption. Okay, so let's move on to some other categories of things we need to keep records for. A lot of you already do this, hopefully, if you are following GAP standards, but documentation of worker training is required. So if you train your workers annually on food safety, you need to keep a record of that pursuant to FSMA now. So here's a worker training record template. The records must be reviewed, dated, signed by the worker, and signed by the supervisor. So this is just a very simple record that allows the employees to sign, the employer to sign at the bottom there with the date, and then you would just need to attach the training materials. So if you're using the DVD that MDA and University of Maryland give out and recommend that workers see every year, then you would just put a copy of that DVD in this folder, and then you'd be all set with that requirement. Agricultural water, there's a lot of agricultural water standards in the produce safety rule. I won't go through them all now. Those other 2 documents I referred you to that are on the ALEI website are good sources of information on that. But growers have to keep the following agricultural water records. Findings, you have to inspect the water system. And this record doesn't require a review, but it's a best practice to have the records reviewed to assure they're correct. Results of analytical tests conducted on agricultural water, test results obtained from the lab must be reviewed, dated, and signed by the supervisor or responsible party within a reasonable time after the records are made. So here's a water system inspection records template that you can use. I will say the agricultural water standards of the Produce Safety Rule are probably, or I would say undoubtedly, the most burdensome part of this rule for most folks. The FDA is reviewing them. They could be further delayed. That's actually, it's proposed that those standards are delayed for a couple years to give folks some time to come up to speed on all this. The public comment for that is open if you want to go on the FDA website and get to the Federal Register and say that you want the ag water standards delayed. They are 2 years later than the implementation of the general rule, regardless of all that. So if you hear that the water testing standards are going to be delayed, that may be true. However, it's a good idea to start trying to comply with the FSMA water quality standards as soon as possible, because if there is something wrong with your water, or if your water doesn't comply with FSMA, that might be something that's going to be time consuming for you to rectify, and you want to know that sooner rather than later. So agricultural water records, these are more records, so scientific data or information growers rely on to support the adequacy of the methods related to water treatment. So if your water doesn't meet the ag water standards and you need to treat it, you need to have documentation of all that. Water treatment monitoring records must be reviewed, dated, and signed by the supervisor. Scientific data or information relied upon to support microbial die-off rates between harvest and the end of storage or removal need to be kept. So here's a water monitoring record that you can keep showing water pH, water temperature, the sanitizer name and rate you use to treat your water. Okay, so more about agricultural water. Documentation of corrective measures. If the ag water doesn't meet the numerical water quality, scientific data or information to support any alternative microbial water quality criteria, die-off, sampling frequencies, support for any equivalent analytical methods used in lieu of the method that's suggested by FSMA. And again, just like always, must be reviewed and dated and signed by a supervisor. So here's a water corrective measure record. What if you use public water? Well, if you use public water, then you just have to keep annual documentation of the results or certificates of compliance from the public water system. So for example, I was just on an urban farm in Baltimore City a couple weeks ago. They told us they use public water since they're in the middle of Baltimore City. They're growing produce for human consumption. They are subject to the Produce Safety Rule. If they meet those financial requirements, they asked what they needed to do, and they were told that they just need to call the water authority and get that certification that the water is up to a certain standard every year. So it has to be an annual record from the water authority. They keep it in their records, and then they're all set. They've complied with the rule. Compost. So if you use compost on the farm, you also need to keep records. For soil amendments that growers treat and apply on their farms, records have to be kept to document process controls, time, temperature, and they have to be reviewed, dated, and signed by a supervisor. So here's a compost treatment record. So you would record the type of compost you used, the time and temperature tests that you did, how often you did them. And you can see at the bottom of this record, it says proper composting production requirement requires a minimum temperature. So it's a good standard just to have the standard right at the bottom of the record is a good practice, because it will make sure that you're complying with the rule and that all of your test results are going to be complying with the legal standard right there on the rule. All right, what about soil amendments that were received from a third party? Well, growers have to document annually that the process used to treat the biological soil amendment, if it's of animal origin, is a scientifically valid process that was carried out with appropriate process monitoring, and the soil amendment of animal origin has been handled, conveyed, and stored in a manner that's going to minimize the risk of contamination. So if you're getting compost of an animal origin from someone else, you're going to need some records to verify that it is safe. Not going to pose a food safety risk. So here's a compost treatment record. All right, manure application. We always get a lot of questions about manure application in FSMA. The tough part about the answer is that we don't really have the answer yet. The FDA has not come down finally on this. They've said that biological soil amendments of animal origin or manure are a likely entry point for contamination into a produce operation, which I think we would all probably agree on that. However, they don't give a lot of definition to what folks are supposed to do if they're using manure on produce. So the recommended standard at this point for the application of raw untreated manure and the appropriate application and harvest windows is to follow the National Organic Standards, which I provided for you there, 90 days from the application for the crops that do not have direct soil contact, and 120 days for the application for crops that have direct contact with the soil. So if you're using manure, those are the records that I would keep. Sanitation. So you have to keep records of the method of cleaning and sanitizing equipment used in covered harvesting, packing, or holding activities. So if you're using tools out in the field, how often are those being cleaned? Harvest equipment, packing equipment. So here's a cleaning and sanitizing record. Pretty simple, date, time, it lists your tools and equipment, cleaned or sanitized, method used, and then just initialed. So this is something, you know, you would just put up in your operation and get your workers into the habit of making a record every time they're cleaning tools and equipment on the farm. So that was kind of a lightning round. I know that was a lot of records that need to be kept. Like I said, these templates were from this source, a document called Records Required by the FSMA Produce Safety Rule out of the Produce Safety Alliance. So if you want any of those records, you can find them at that link. If that doesn't work for some reason, you can email me at saraheverhart@law.umaryland.edu or call me at 410-458-2475. I know that FSMA implementation is not going to be easy for a lot of folks. All of us at the Ag Law Education Initiative are happy to help, happy to answer questions. If I can't answer the question, I will find somebody that can. So with that, does anyone have any questions based on my presentation today?
There's a chat pod down bottom here, so if anyone wants to add to the chat, we should be able to see questions. This was great, Sarah. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I think also, you know, sharing what's going to work for people, you know, in the field. I think that's one of the hardest things. We see it with pesticide records, nutrient management records, organic records, just keeping regular inventories, having an efficient system that makes it easy to record while you're in the field, to be able then to go back and if you're going to do it electronically or have to file a report, you know, having something that's going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Having something that's going to work and having something that you would feel comfortable giving in response to a record request, I think is really an important thing to think about here. You wouldn't want a regulatory agency digging through all of your farm's business records or, you know, potentially all of your business type records. So it's important to keep separate records so that you're fully prepared and that a record request and review isn't going to reveal things you don't want revealed and isn't going to, you know, stop your operation for a week because you're digging through things. That's not what we want. Okay, I see one question. Procedure for getting an exemption, example of exempt operations. That's a great question. There is going to be a procedure for getting the exemption. There's going to be legislation this year, hopefully, I think, introduced in the Maryland General Assembly to start that process with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. So at this point, there's not a specific procedure. I think the best things that people can do now is to go ahead and you can download that form that I gave you now and go through your business records and see where you are in terms of if you think you're eligible for a qualified exemption. I would get all that documentation ready. And if you think you are, then when the Department of Agriculture is at the point where they're assessing that, then you'll be all set. Examples of exempt operations. An example of an exempt operation would be, let's say you have a produce farm, you have an on-farm produce stand, a roadside stand, and you have a CSA. So you're selling, but you're selling more than $26,000 in annual produce sales in the last 3 years. So you're selling $28,000 in the last 3 years, but you're only the majority of the food is going directly to the consumer, qualified end user. So that would be an example. You're not going to any kind of a wholesaler. I'm just flipping back to that slide now. Your food isn't being distributed widely. Your food is just being distributed directly from your farm. So a qualified end user would be the consumer, so that would be the person that walked up to your roadside stand and bought the food, or through a CSA to the qualified end user. Is the 26,632 for exempt a combination of the last 3 years or each year? It is the last 3 years averaged. So you take the last 3 years and average them. And that's, if you're getting to that if you're over average annual produce sales of the last 3 years, if you're over $26,000, then the rule applies to you. Whether or not you get a qualified exemption depends on whether you meet these other two criteria. Is a Maryland GAP certificate or exemption recognized in other states? Well, this would be, FSMA is different than GAP. So GAP certifications are still going, you can still be GAP certified in Maryland. This year you can go to a FSMA course or you can go to a GAP course. If FSMA applies to you, you do have to go through some training. One responsible person on your farm has to be trained. So a good place to keep an eye out for those trainings would be our website, the Department of Agriculture website. We'll be giving out those dates. I would have given them today if I know them. I don't know them yet. They're typically, I bet they're going to be in January, February this year, the FSMA courses. Will a certified exemption or a qualified exemption from one state apply in another state? That's a great question. I don't know the answer. It should, because it's the same law that's going to apply to every state equally. So I would think that if you got a qualified exemption from the Maryland Department of Agriculture, that's something you would also be eligible for from the Delaware Department of Agriculture, because they would be dealing with the same standards. So that's my answer to that. I wish I had a better one. Yeah, and Shannon's right. Extension will have the winter meeting dates for FSMA. That will be advertised through Extension as well. So if this applies to you and you haven't gone to a course, I encourage you to keep an eye out for those winter courses and attend a training course as well, because it will obviously answer a lot more questions. Those were good questions. Anybody else? Okay, well, if you think of something driving down the road, feel free to give me a call. That's what I'm here for, or shoot me an email. If you have a question, somebody else probably has the same question, and a lot of times if I get a good question on a topic like this, I will write a post about it on the Maryland Risk Management Education blog. We do have a lot of past posts on FSMA because of all the different questions that it raises. All right, let's see, one more question. If you use your produce in value-added products, does that factor into the sales amount? Whew, that's a good one. If you use your produce in value-added products, it would depend which standard you're talking about. So, sorry if this is making people dizzy to go back through my slides. To figure out the applicability standards, you're just looking at produce sales. So that is just the amount of produce you're selling to folks, and it's produce that is typically consumed raw. However, for the qualified exemption, you're looking at more than half of the average annual monetary value of the food the farm sold was directly to qualified end users. So I guess my answer is it would depend which standard you're trying to figure out if it's applicable to you. One is just produce sales. So if you were growing produce, putting it in value-added products, and then selling the products, I don't think that that would count as a produce sale. However, if you're trying to figure out if you're eligible for the qualified exemption, that would, because that is food encompasses a lot of different things. We've had a lot of folks ask us if food includes things like soybeans and grains that are used for animal feed and poultry and things like that. And the answer to that is yes. It is purposely used to be an all-encompassing word and to cut down on who is eligible for the qualified exemption. I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, please shoot me an email and I'm happy to give you some more detail on that. Okay, anybody else? Well, thank you all very much.
Thanks, Sarah.